The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Welcome to a discussion with author Clifton L. Taulbert. I'm Steve Benson. Clifton, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me here.
Clifton Taulbert is the author of a trilogy, The Last Train North and Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored. And the third book is right now in with your editor, I understand.
It's with my editor, safely with my editor.
When the crops came in?
Yeah, the season-out crops came in.
I'm fascinated by the storyteller as both an insider and an outsider. And in the small Mississippi town that you grew up in, you were both an insider and also an outsider.
Yeah, you know, and you're the first to have actually picked up on that. I was an insider in that I actually lived beneath the very shadow of the people of the porch. And I called them the people of the porch because they had no other places of prestige or power. So they would gather on the porches. And this is where they would actually make community happen. But being a little boy, I was really not part of the porch conversations, as it were, other than the admonitions that would come hurtling down like thunderbolts for me to get my act together and that type of thing. But I watched their world from a distance, and I had a chance to really be impacted by people who really understood community and its full implication.
And also those wonderful trips that you would take with your grandfather, Papa, on Saturdays.
Yeah. I was born in a house that my great-grandfather built at the turn of the century, and it had a long front porch and had a rocking chair that sat on the west side. The rocking chair never moved. Papa was always there, except when he was driving the 1949 Buick. Weekdays it was a field truck, but on Saturday morning transformation took place. The car became my way out. We'd go to Greenville, Mississippi, the Queen City of the Delta, get frozen custard ice cream and hot French bread. And I'd shine that car so you could see my face, your face, and into the future in that car. Get all the field dirt out. And my grandfather would shave every Saturday, long before Michael Jordan knew about a bald head. Papa did. Papa was shaving and shaving and shaving, and he'd finally get his suit on. And I'd go out and sit on the porch and wait for him, pull my knees up to my chin, and I'd look as far as I could. And I couldn't see much because our world really rarely changed. But then the screen door would open, and Papa would say, "Clifton, let's go to Greenville to get frozen custard ice cream and hot French bread." But you know, it was more than a trip to Greenville. It was really a trip into the rest of my life.
And of course, your grandfather, he was a Baptist preacher. He had to stop and talk with half the town, much to your probably disgust and maybe a little bit of delight.
Well, you know, I think you're being kind when you say delight, because it was to my disgust. You know, as a little boy, I wanted to be alone with him. The Buick was a comfortable place, no plastic seats. I mean, you remember? I don't know if you remember a 1949 Buick, but the seats were real soft, and they were like cloth, nice cloth material. But Papa would make me get out of the front seat, though, and he'd actually become the taxi. I mean, we were on our way to do our thing together, but Papa would always stop, talk to everybody, tipped his hat to every person sitting on the front porch, and picked up anyone that was hitchhiking. But little did I know, as I look back some 30 years later, community was happening right in front of me. He didn't tell me a story about the value of making room for people in your world. He just did it, and I saw it.
Well, so many memories of childhood involve food and family and community, and your book does that to a wonderful extent.
Now, you cannot write the South without writing food. That was part and parcel of our lives, and I've often said that every Southern cook, whether they lived in a mansion with pillars that reached for the sky or the shotgun houses that kept us anchored to the soil, their main objective was to cook food until it died. Eating dead food in Mississippi was a way of life, always starting with a tablespoon of grease, whether you needed it or not.
Later on, you talk about riding on the train and having the butter and the grease melt right through the paper, and it's translucent.
I mean, I'm serious, you know, because no one had really told them about lard and what lard would do to your arteries. And so they fried that chicken. I mean, They really fried it. They put a lot in those iron skillets. And that chicken would just, and you know, it has to come, something has to happen to that lard. It can't stay in the chicken. So when they put your lunch in the brown paper bag and your buttermilk pound cake, give you the last kiss and the last hug and send you off into your future. All the while this is going on, there's another parallel transformation. The grease is now coming out of the chicken, and the brown paper bag that was once dry has now become so translucent it has become a cheap window pane from which you can see it all.
There's a wonderful sequence in the novel where you talk about a hog killing, and as I mentioned to you before we went on the air, I've also been at a hog killing in the countryside, and it's a very strange and very primitive rite, but at the same time it's very communal and very family.
You know, it is. It's very communal. I remember hog killing as being the time when the men and women operated within the realms of equality, because everyone had specific responsibilities, but my great aunt seemed to always come out as the person in charge, making sure that no one who was not supposed to would take away the good parts of the hog. And then you'd watch this big hairy hog being dumped into this big barrel of hot water, softening the hair so that it could be scraped away. But I remember most my grandfather, I don't know if you remember reading that part, Granddaddy Julius, he would fry liver right there on the spot. And if a person ever wants to change their feel about the taste of liver, just pretend that you're killing a hog. And Grandpa Julius is there and the skillet is red hot. And he has all kinds of herbs and salt and pepper. And then he flours this liver and drops it over into the skillet. And you can see the stinging hot flour pebbles jumping up at you. And you can smell this liver. And he just so delicately cuts you a little piece and gives it to you. And really, there's a taste, a real taste there.
And this is a hog that you had actually cared for, built the pen for, and chased out of various people's gardens.
Oh yeah, it was the old sow that perhaps should have been considered family. But she never got out in the afternoon when it was an appropriate time. She would always root out of her pen around midnight. And my name would always be called. I was the oldest child. I don't know why my father didn't want to go get the hog in. It was his hog. But I had to get the hog in, and it would always get into Miss Mary Ann's, Aunt Mary Ann's garden, and it would always go to the mustard green patch. I mean, never go to anything that was like she was through with, the good mustard green patch. And it doesn't matter. She'd always hear the hog, and she'd always come to our house, and I always had to get up and get him back in. So it was a bittersweet day when the sow said goodbye. But
the bullet shots.
Yeah,
in the distance.
The bullet shots, you could hear them, the last squeal. But somehow the smell and taste of bacon sort of kind of got you over it pretty quickly.
Another great occasion was the annual day. Tell us about the annual day.
Annual days in the South, that's part of the church structure. Those were the times when community members came together, brought all kinds of food, but it was really part of a burial association. It was the banks of small black communities to make sure that when a person died, they weren't embarrassed. There was a tremendous fear of dying and not having the funds to get a decent casket and the right dress and the right clothes. For many, death became an opportunity to be the grand lady or the gentleman that you knew you were. And these sister worker societies had these assessments on a monthly basis that people paid in 10, 15, 20, some 50 or 60 years. But at their death, they would get either a check for $60 or $75 or something of that sort. And some people belonged to 10 of them so that you could add them up and you'd have enough money when you died that you really wouldn't be a burden on your family. You would have taken care of yourself. So each year, the annual day would happen and people would do an assessment of where you were, how much you owed. But it was also the time that family and friends would come from up north, because many of the northern relatives, they still, for whatever reason, maintain their connective links to the Sister Workers Society.
And that sense of community and coming together, the black church has almost always been the glue in the South. You're living in the segregated South. The church is both a refuge and a community.
The church has been the center of our lives, socially, economically, and politically, because it was one of the few institutions that was really under the control of blacks. Within the structure of the church, the field hands, the maids, the tractor drivers, the few teachers that were in our community, they could become deacons, mothers board members, trustees, missionaries. I mean, real positions of prominence within a limited world. And the church became the avenue by which you could express, this is who I am, this is what I can do, this is how far I can go. So it was more than just a place to save your soul and prepare you for the hereafter. But for many people, it was the place in which you prepared for daily life.
And there were a few heroes in the community, except for the minister. And then you have a wonderful sequence where you talk about the brown bomber, Joe Louis, who I remember as a kid as well.
Yeah, you know, the term heroes was really not widely used when I was a child. It seemed to be more of a modern phenomenon. And in writing the book, I tried to write it in the context of my memory. And there were people in the community that we respected on a daily basis because their lives and their contribution to us demanded that respect. But there were other people outside of the community that we looked to and we read about. And of course, Joe Louis being among the one that the men talked about often because of his prowess and his skill as a boxer. For he said for many of them with his fists what they could never say with their own voices.
In some of the reviews of the book, there are people that are angry that they wish that you would have written a much tougher, a stronger book, written their stories rather than yours. How do you feel about that, Clifton?
Well, you know, I've made the statement that, yes, I did grow up in the segregated South. The Jim Crow laws were there. But I've tried to write the stories of humane remembering because I think that literature is a powerful force to get you into the future. And I'm not quite sure if I could have told another hanging story that would have made the noose any tighter or any less. If I could have told another story of white-black conflict that would have made it any more graphic than what we already know it to be. But there's something about humane remembering. When I tell the story of Papa, whose life was disenfranchised by virtue of his color, yet unselfishly he became an umbrella for a young boy who didn't have the power to stop the rain.
Well, yeah, and you see in those individuals the petty humiliations of the Jim Crow era when he's at the gas station and he's really not treated with respect.
And you come away looking at that, but you also follow this man into his house. And this is what I think as a writer that I've tried to do. Yes, there was an humiliating incident at the gas station. And many writers they wanted me to stay at the gas station. But I didn't live at the gas station. I lived in Papa's house. Racism lived at the gas station. That belonged to the white people. Papa always said it's their problem. It wasn't mine. He said, I didn't start this.
I want to take a look at some of the other aspects of life in this little town. It's such a wonderful town. It's sort of everybody's small town. One of the things that I really was fascinated by was going to the colored school. Tell us about the colored school.
Well, it was a starship. It was a Polaris missile, if you will. It was the one place that dreams could come true. And education was so stressed in those small communities. Miss Maxey was the teacher, taught all 8 grades there. And she emotionally would take us to the windows and actually point out the stars and tell us that we could be part of it. Even though for many of us, our books were secondhand. You know, we knew all the jokes that the white boys told because we got their books and they'd write them in the sidelines. I mean, I don't know what it would have meant to have had new books or books that were up to date because we never got them. I traveled 100 miles round trip to high school every day for 4 years, past 2 white high schools along the way. But I don't remember, yes, I remember, but I don't really concentrate on the drudgery of the journey as much as I remember the strength of my great aunt, who every morning got up and flipped the porch light so Mr. Murray would know that I'd be going to school. Her dependability has become the story rather than the racism that made me see it.
I'm fascinated by stories and storytelling, and in one of the sections you talk about the stories when someone was ill and when someone was dying.
Yeah, everything ends in small towns as well as in cities. It's called the end of the season. All the crops were in and the cotton had been picked and the leaves had fallen off the pecan tree. My great-grandmother died that season, and it was a time that it seemed if no one died within 15 minutes, most people died at home. And maybe because of not knowing much about medicine or not having access to modern medicine as we know it today, they seem to have died for days. The process of dying took a process. It was a process. But I remember not necessarily the sadness of my great-grandmother's death, but I remember that it was a community affair. Glen Allen, Mississippi was a place where you weren't allowed to be born alone and you weren't allowed to die alone.
Another place that stories were told were at quilt making. And quilts have a wonderful place in particularly the black community. And these were often quilts that were pieced together and then sent to that mysterious place called the North. And I'd like to have you read a section on quilt making for us.
Okay, thank you. A quilt from Glen Allen was truly from the community. For representative scraps of brightly colored cloth came from all over our little town. Dresses and pants no longer worn and Sunday shirts unable to be patched all became part of the heap. Running through Glen Allen, I'd occasionally be stopped by Miss Sissies or Miss Stell, who had saved bags of old clothes for the quilters. This collection of materials and scraps no longer needed would become the blocks and squares of flowers, birds, and patterned stars that would eventually be stitched together to form the top of the quilt. As I sat holding my quilt from home, I recalled vividly the start of the season. When the fall winds entered the Delta, the ladies' mind turned to quilting. It seemed as if those of Mapunk's household always started to rounds together to scrap up the materials needed. Securely tucked away in the loft at Mapunk's house were the quilting frames, wooden poles that had grown smooth from the scores of tired hands and the years of use. Always one to give me my orders, Mapunk would see that the frames were taken down and the hooks securely placed in the ceiling. She never trusted me to tie the poles. She always did that herself. Once the frames were set up, there was hardly enough room to move around in the little front room. But soon the frames were covered with the starts of the quilt, and encamped all around it would be the older women who for years had followed this time-honored tradition. By the light from an exposed 60-watt bulb and the flickering flame from the wood stove, I could see the ladies, bespectacled, tired, some of them still dipping snuff. They had worked all week at other jobs, but they somehow found the creative energy needed to do the quilting. They hummed, gossiped, and talked to themselves as the patterns from their minds began to take shape. I was not allowed to sit in the room, but I would pass by the open door 1,000 times, hearing the gossip not meant for my ears while seeing them working hard at a gift of love. And as the patterns grew and the gossip stopped, the quilts were pieced to the sounds of Dr. Watt's hymn and the news from up north. When fall ushered in the quilting season, the men of Glen Allen also had their traditions. Now facing a lull in the fields, they would get their .22 rifles to hunt squirrels and rabbits and possums. They would leave early in the morning, headed for the woods, leaving the women to do the quilting. Though hunting and quilting were both traditional autumn events, it was the quilting that carried the hearts of the people and the warmth of the South up north. According to those ladies of the South, our Southern bones would never adjust to the cold of the North. Quilts were needed, and nothing less would do. Prized possessions by both Southerners and Northerners, these designs from the hearts and minds were always secure in the trunks and large chests of drawers. Piles of handmade quilts were a status symbol, a show of industry, skill, and love. Quilts were treasures to be envied and coveted. Even today, some 30 years later, I sometimes hear my mother and others discussing with dismay the disappearance of Mama Pearl's quilts after she had died. Quilts were rarely ever sold, but always passed on from one generation to the next. Most often, when older black Southerners died, there was little or no money left. Much of the land had been lost, stolen, or sold. The greatest treasures they had to pass down to their children were the quilt. Soon after the funeral was over, friends and kinfolk of the deceased would gather for food and memories and the traditional sharing of the quilts. Each quilt had its own particular story, and the materials used represented the times of that person's life, the joy and the sadness he or she experienced. As a child in the Mississippi Delta, I had been part of that time-honored tradition of quilting. Not only did I collect the scraps, but I helped to box and pack the quilts that would be sent north to relatives. Without fail, quilts maintained the connecting link between the Southerners that went north and those that stayed behind. Now I had gone north, and the connection was unbroken. My punk had sent her heart in the warmth of my community. As memories flooded my mind, I could hear the old people in Glen Allen saying, "Give her up, child, give her up. It'll keep the chill out."
Wonderful passage. You went north, you were 17 years old, and it was a father that you had never known who brought you north.
Yes, I was born to my mother when she was in high school. My father was slightly older, a very handsome guy, good talker, no doubt, but they never married. And he went north and lived there all of his life. And I was, 16 when I first met him. And he asked me to come to live with him at that time.
That was hard for you to leave the South, but at the same time there was that pull, the cousins, the aunts and uncles who would come down talking about that place up north.
You know, it was a journey that we had to take because there had been so many before us that had taken it. And you felt as if you had not really completed your rite of passage if you did not take such a journey. And when the opportunity came to me, it was a bittersweet opportunity. It was bitter in that I would leave Papa's house, my punk, my mother, my sisters and brothers, the people that had known me long before I knew myself. But I also knew that Glen Allen was too small to make all of my dreams come true. And for me, the North would be that place. So I left them, and I took the last train north to St. Louis.
Literally the last train, the Illinois Central, closed out that line.
Yeah, it closed out that line, no longer bringing passengers back and forth to the south and to northern cities.
Well, to many people, St. Louis really isn't the North.
Yeah, I know. But for me, it was north of the Mason-Dixon line, and I was absolutely assured by those who lived there that even the grass was greener and the dirt was cleaner. To me, it was the North.
But you did write that you slept through passing the Mason-Dixon line.
I thought that the Mason-Dixon line was this physical point of transformation because that's all I had ever heard. You know, you could eat in the dining car. You could go to the same bathroom. I mean, there were so many human, wonderful things that would happen once you crossed the Mason-Dixon line. So I just assumed that it would be a tremendous place of passage, balloons and I guess trumpets and drums telling people that you had now entered into what America could really be. But I slept through it.
That wonderful second book is a coming of age, and you're a country kid from a small town into the big city of St. Louis, and you're staying. It's the dreams were not quite what they had been presented to you.
Not really. In fact, the first time I got to St. Louis to the train station, at that moment in time, it was truly the North. The train station, the Union Station in St. Louis, was a grand place. I saw more people in one place than I'd ever seen in all my life. I remember the benches. They were long, long, mahogany, polished benches. The sun danced on the marble floors. The beautiful designs of the stained glass windows in the ceilings. The people all seemed to be well dressed. And then there were the colored porters, this wonderful cadre of professional black people, their black suits, their white shirts, stiffer than boards, their gold watch, Even though no one knew their names, they were all called George. But to me, they were the conductors. They were in control. I don't know if everyone else perceived them as such, but you know, people would entrust their children to these porters without knowing their names, send them from New York to New Orleans, as did Mapone. She put me in the hands of the trusted colored porter, and he promised her that I would get to St. Louis safely, and I did. But after I left the train station, and that particular world of the porters, the trains, and the people, and the mahogany benches, as I drove into the city, I think I began to awaken. And the more my eyes became open, less of a dream I saw.
Sort of like Miss Pinky's soda water ice cream.
Yes.
Better in the imagining than in the taste.
Than in the taste. That's right.
Your books now are being made into a movie. Can you tell us a little bit about translating these wonderful stories to the screen?
Yeah, Once Upon a Time has been made into a major motion picture. Tim Reed, the producer who brought us Frank's Place, has done an excellent job of bringing together a wonderful cast. Al Freeman Jr. plays my great-grandfather, and he does a great job. Even drives a 1949 Buick, as well as Papa did, even as slow as he did. Felicia Richard plays my great-aunt Mapone who raised me, and that was really interesting, watching Mrs. Cosby pick cotton. Polly Bergen plays the older white lady that I worked for as a child, growing up in the Mississippi Delta. Richard Roundtree plays Uncle Cleve, who was the Iceman in Glen Allen. And Damon Hines, young actor who played Danny Glover's son in the movies Lethal Weapons 1, 2, and 3, plays me as the older boy. It was a time of deja vu, I guess. They stuck so closely to the book that when I saw outtakes from it, of the dailies, and subsequently the premiere screening of the movie, they asked me, they all wanted to know my opinion. And I told them it was like coming to a good movie for the second time.
Wonderful story. Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, sir.
Clifton L. Taulbert, he's the author of The Last Train North, and thank you for joining us on A Discussion With. I'm Steve Benson.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.